Hour. Normally I would open with the latest on health and healing, take a look at our environment, then go to our commentaries of the day, and finally our guest. But today I'm going to begin with our guest, and for the first half hour, we will take calls for the guest in about 20 minutes. He is Gerald Celente. Gerald is one of today's pioneers in trend strategy. He founded the Trends Research Institute and its Trends Journal in 1980 and has since been one of the nation's most sought-after diagnosticians and forecasters. He is able to do predictions in over 300 fields, from business and finance and politics and the environment, society, and technology. And he is also an author, and he has, well, all you have to do is just look at what he does. The Trends Journal, which is published 4 times a year, and you can get it at trendsresearch.com, has been remarkably accurate. So we're beginning with him to take a look at all the different things happening. Nice to have you with us today, Gerald.
Oh, it's always great being on with you, Gary. Thank you.
Gerald, I'm going to go through several issues and then select the issues that you find important to take on, all right?
All right.
In today's paper, there was a statement under the Post Business. Quote, headline, $60 trillion in debt. Does anybody know what the U.S. owes? But that's the low figure. They also believe that a Lawrence Kotlikoff from Boston University economist professor says it's $200 trillion. So we have Andrew Moylan of the National Taxpayers Union. We have David Walker, U.S. Comptroller General, 50 trillion, Andrew 60, and the professor 200 trillion. None of these figures is currently being cited for examples of why we should be more careful about the money we do spend and have a downsizing of all agencies across the board. That's one issue. Now I'll go through the others. You predicted over 2 months ago on this program that if gold went to 1,300, it would go up to 1,500 quickly. Here's the latest from Bob Chapman, Global Research. Quote, gold rebounds, dollar plummets, higher inflation's on the way. I'll quote the first paragraph. Gold is again broken out to new highs, and the silver's on the cusp of doing so well as well also. Unfortunately, more than 95% of the pundits were not on board. They believed it was going to go lower. The fight for monetary supremacy between the dollar and the gold for the past 16 months has been won by gold, and that is why gold is moving higher and the dollar lower. The recent intervention in the currency markets by Japan, ostensibly to weaken the yen, assisted by the U.S. and foreign central banks, won't strengthen the dollar for any appreciable period of time. The U.S. dollar has broken down, and there is no going back. How can anyone want to be long on the dollar when it has lost 80% of its value in 11 years versus purchasing power and more than 15% annually versus gold? The current rally that has just begun will last through February and perhaps through June before there is any meaningful correction. By then, we could be looking at $3,000 an ounce for gold. It's anyone's guess as to how high it's going, but one thing is for sure, it is going higher. Separately, the global system is in crisis, not just here in America, towards a serious breakdown of the world economic and financial system by the spring of 2011. And I'll just quote the first paragraph, quote, as anticipated in our most recent research, the second half of 2010 is readily characterized by a sudden worsening of the crisis marked by the end of the illusion of recovery maintained by the Western leaders and the thousands of billions swallowed up by the banks and economic stimulating plans of no lasting effect. The coming months will reveal a simple yet especially painful reality. The Western economy, and in particular that of the United States, never really came out of the recession. The startling statistics recorded this summer have only been the short-lived consequences of a massive injection of liquidity into a system which had essentially become insolvent, just like the U.S. consumer. At the heart of the global systemic crisis since its inception, the United States is, in the coming months, going to demonstrate that it is, once again, in the process of leading the economy and global finances into the heart of darkness. because it can't get out of this very great U.S. depression, thus coming out of the political upheavals of the U.S. elections this November. With growth once again negative, the world will have to face the very serious breakdown of the global economic and financial system founded over 60 years ago on the absolute necessity of the U.S. economy never being in a lasting recession. Now, the first half of 2011 will dictate that the U.S. economy take an unprecedented dose of austerity, plunging the planet into new financial, monetary, and economic and social chaos. Next, surge in housing supply will drive down prices, from Mike Whitney, who you know. Here's what he says, quote, home ownership has become an albatross. Prices are falling, demand is weak, foreclosures have skyrocketed, and inventory of those foreclosed houses is backed up to the moon. If there's an upside, we can't see it. Everyone who bought a house in the last 6 to 7 years knows that he has been fleeced by bankers who were pushing fish wrap mortgages paper to line their own pockets. Prices do not reflect the underlying supply-demand fundamentals as much as they expose the massive mortgage laundering operation that was taking place in the shadow banking system. Hedge fund sharpies and other speculators walked away with billions, while credulous homeowners were lashed to an anvil and tossed in the East River. Finally, now there are signs that the Fed teamed up with banks to get another pound of homeowners' flesh by keeping inventory off the market while they were exchanging $1.25 trillion in reserves for the banks' non-performing loans and mortgage-backed securities. Here's how it works. While the Fed was executing its quantitative easing program, the banks began to stockpile foreclosed homes to reduce supply and thus stabilize prices. It was all a hoax to conceal the transfer of reserves for garbage assets. Now that the banks are loaded with fresh reserves, they don't need to play along anymore, which is why they've started dumping their massive backlog of houses on the market. As inventory floods the market, housing prices will tumble and homeowners will take another pounding. And that's that. And one last one here. This is really an unusual one. Israeli company hired by the state government of Pennsylvania to spy on Pennsylvanians and other Americans, by David Lindorf from commondreams.org. Quote, the surprise disclosure that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, through its state Homeland Security Agency, along with a number of local police departments in the state, have been employing a private Israeli security company with strong links to Mossad and the Israeli Defense Forces grows increasingly disturbing when the website of the company, called the Institute of Terrorism Research and Response, is examined. And it goes on to talk about how the state of Pennsylvania hired this Israeli security firm to look at anyone in any group that was protesting anything. So if you were protesting against banks, if you were protesting against the government, if you were protesting against vaccines, all protesters are now, in effect, in line to be investigated, infiltrated, and possibly put on terrorist lists. So goes our democracy. Have you heard a word from Keith Olbermann? You won't hear a thing out of his mouth or anyone else on the left. It's as if no amount of egregious stealing of our rights is important to people on the left. And finally, this is from Les Leopold, who you know. And this I'm going to take a little bit of time with and then turn it all over to you. Poverty is through the roof, and billionaires are getting angry about not enough profits. From Alternet, quote, the ranks of the working poor in the United States climbed to the highest level since the 1960s as the recession threw millions of people out of work last year, leaving 1 in 7 Americans in poverty. The overall poverty rate climbed to 14.3%, or 44 million people. While 44 million Americans live in poverty, the richest men of finance sure are getting angry. First, Steve Schwarzman, head of the BlackRock private equity company, compares the Obama administration's efforts to close billionaires' tax loopholes to, quote, the Nazi invasion of Poland. Then hedge fund mogul David Loeb announces that he's abandoning the Democrats because they're violating, quote, this country's core founding principles, including non-punitive taxation, constitutionally guaranteed protections against persecution of the minority, and the right of self-determination, unquote. Instead of showing their outrage about the spread of poverty in the richest nation on earth, the super rich want us to pity them. Why are Wall Street billionaires so whiny? Is it really possible to make $900,000 an hour? That's not a typo. That's an hour. That's what the top hedge fund managers take in, and still feel aggrieved about the way government is treating you? After you've been bailed out by the federal government to the tune of $10 trillion, also not a typo, in loans, asset swaps, liquidity, and other guarantees, can you really still feel like an oppressed minority? You'd think that Wall Street moguls would be thankful, not just thankful, down on their knees, kissing the ground taxpayers walk on, and hollering hallelujah at the top of their lungs. These guys profited from pulling up the housing bubble, then got bailed out when the going got tough, and without taxpayers' largesse, these hedge fund honchos would be flat broke. Instead, they're back to hauling in obscene profits. These billionaires don't even have to worry about serious financial reforms. The paltry legislation that squeaked through Congress did nothing to end too big and too interconnected to fail. In fact, the biggest firms got even bigger as they gobbled up troubled banks with the generous support of the federal government. No bank or hedge fund was broken up. Nobody was forced to pay a financial transaction tax. None of the big boys had a cap placed on their astronomical wealth. No, none of that happened. And now the big bankers are still free to create and trade the very derivatives that catapulted us into this global crisis. You'd think that billionaires would be praying on the altar of government and erecting statues on Capitol Hill in honor of Saint Bailout. Your thoughts, the forum is yours.
Well, just on that last note that you were talking about, with the quotes from the billionaires whining, Schwartzman saying that, closing the billionaire tax loopholes is, quote, the equivalent of the Nazi invasion of Poland, or that guy Loeb saying that non-punitive taxation constitutionally guaranteed protections against persecutions of the minority. Suppose a Celente said and compared the taxation of billionaires to the Nazi invasion of Poland, or the persecution of minorities. Boy, would I, the toilet paper of record, the New York Times, they call what I do pessimism porn, but they let a Schwartzman and a Loeb get away with this. And just to double up on that, Gary, pick up yesterday's toilet paper record, and there's billionaire Bloomberg with the rest of them bawling about how this is hurting them so much, and how all those people out there that supported Obama, now they're unhappy. Here's the quote. He said, I feel strongly we should not be, and he goes, success should not be frowned on. And I have lots of friends, wealthy people, made a lot of money, were big Obama supporters, gave him money, raised money for him, who are not happy now. They all say the same thing, quote, I knew I was going to have to pay more taxes. Somebody's got to do it, and I've got the money. But I didn't expect to be vilified. Vilified. You want to tax, and I love this Obama coming out, we're going to tax the rich. And you know what he calls the rich? He calls the rich Obama. People making between $200,000 and $250,000 a year. That's where the burden's going to fall upon. And there are people out there, that we make that kind of money, and we work really hard to make that kind of money. And it ain't rich, because they're taxing you at every corner. They have every federal regulator coming down on you. You don't get away with a penny. But I have friends, says Bloomberg. Wealthy friends. Oh, yeah, they're all wealthy friends, all right. Yeah, and they don't like what's going on. Because people like Warren Buffett, the money junkies, that's all these people are. They're addicts. They're junkies. They can never have enough. They can never have enough. And now they're crying because they're going to take some of their junk from them. And what do? Is they have people like Buffett who's paying the same tax rate as his secretary.